Thank you for joining us today on this episode of Kyber Clips. We're here today to talk about common questions we hear around CMMC and the CMMC process. I'm joined by Bob Thomas, CIO, CISO for Kyber and our clients. I'm Mike Jafrida, President of Kyber Security. Hopefully this information will help educate you so you could be more prepared for the process that you have to undergo if you do need to be CMMC compliant. So maybe we'll just start, Bob, by telling us what is CMMC compliance. What's the hubbub?
What's all the hubbub, Bub? So, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification is what CMMC stands for, just another acronym in our world. It is the latest incarnation of the Department of Defense's attempt at securing technology and military information so that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands, and it's getting pushed down through every piece of the defense industrial base. So anybody that plays in that realm, that deals with what we're going to talk about in a minute, federal contract information or controlled unclassified information, needs to have controls, programs, plans in place to protect that data. And this used to be referred to as DFARS, DFARS, or 800-171 as the procurement mechanism for people buying and selling inside the defense industrial base from one contractor to another, or subcontractor, I guess, in order to make something like the Sikorsky Black Hawk helicopter, for instance. You know, there's 1,000 parts in that thing. They probably don't come from one or two people. They are coming from literally 100 different suppliers or more, and everybody along that food chain needs to be in compliant. Like I said, 800-171 was the compliance previously. CMMC is the new animal, the new sheriff in town, I guess, is what it's referred to. And I say sheriff, not just because it's a joke, but there's enforcement that comes with this. There's audits. Yes, there's self-assessment. But at level 2 and level 3, there is mandatory audits that are going to be taking place every 3 years at level 2, and it will be an independent outside auditing firm that will come in and will determine whether you are compliant with all the controls that are required to protect that information. If they say no, that's it. You will not get awarded any contracts. That's what's coming down the line.
So the prior system, NIST 800-171, DFARS,
Yep.
The controls for level 2 of CMMC are the same as NIST 800-171,
Right.
DFARS. However, the way that you've implemented those controls, or whether or not you've actually implemented those controls, regardless of what you checked off on the self-assessment in the past, will now be validated.
It will be validated, and there's even some more complexity as to how they're being implemented now and what they're looking for on that auditing process. They're looking for what they say is true governance. They want to make sure that there's policy, there's procedures, there is meat behind exactly how you're executing this. This is not happenstance.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Sure. So now that I just mentioned it, controlled unclassified information and federal contract information, why do we care? Why does a defense industrial base provider really care about those things, and how does that play into all of this?
Yeah, so let's start with the FCI piece of this.
Yep.
FCI, federal contract information, first of all, should be indicated on any contract that it has FCI, although any contract from the DoD likely has federal contract information because it's information about that federal contract.
Great.
And that the protection of that is CMMC level 1 required. So there's 17 controls in that step required to make sure that you're handling that information in a reasonable fashion. Far less onerous than if you have controlled unclassified information, which would then require you to be at level 2 compliance. So
much bigger deal.
And it is a bigger deal because the information that's in those contracts now talks about actual workings and intellectual property and process of something that is being produced, like your example of the Sikorsky helicopter, which you really don't want in the hands of someone who might be in a war against a Sikorsky helicopter, right? So that type of information is really the crux of the whole CMMC program, and trying to make sure that that's what gets protected. One of the keys of the new CMMC rule is that all contracts have to be marked with what type of information is in that contract, because prior to CMMC, when it was the NIST 800-171, everybody had the same level of protections necessary. Didn't matter if you had FCI, CUI, didn't make any difference how big you were, where you were, whatever.
We're all playing in the same pool.
Right, but now there's levels, and because there's levels, you really need to know, am I protecting CUI, am I protecting FCI? There's different standards for that, and if you're going to be held accountable for doing it, you need to be made aware that you have it. So that is one of the key components, I believe, in the CMMC rule, is that all of those contracts need to be marked with what type of information's in there, so you know how to properly control it.
I think that's really important to know, because that takes all the ambiguity out of it. What level do I need? What am I really protecting? Which category does this fall under? What am I supposed to be doing? And that's I think that's what's been a real problem for people that play in this space, in the defense industrial base. They don't know what they don't know, and they're not being told how to protect items. There's been guesses, hope we're doing it right, but there's been no de facto, yes, this is CUI contained information, you need to protect it in such a manner.
That's absolutely correct. So, new compliance comes down the road. What happens if I don't comply?
You lose, Charlie. So, I think the most important thing as part of this is to understand when you're going to be notified that you are not able to get a contract. In the 800-171 world, there was a lot of time on the front end spent, we can't bid on that because it says we have to be 800-171, and people weren't compliant, even though they had self-assessment questionnaires they were working on. Now we're at the point where there will be a stamped certification from the cyber accrediting board that says you either are or you are not. You either passed or failed, and if you've passed, you can be awarded contracts. If you failed, you can go all the way up until the point of the award date. You've received the RFQ, you've bid on whatever the product or service is, and now they're ready to award, and they said, we're going to award it to you if you can prove you have that CMMC certification seal of honor that says you're compliant. Oh, we're not. Oh, well, you're not getting awarded the contract. And I think that's where the rubber hits the road on this whole thing is, you mean I'm not going to be able to do the work even though I won the bid? Yes, that's exactly what's going to happen. If you're not in compliance, that's where the potential loss comes in, is you're not going to be able to get the contract, even though you thought, because you were able to bid on it, and there was no notification in advance that said you couldn't, because I'm not so sure anybody really cares until award date now. That's where.
Well, the asterisk on that, I would say, is that some upstream providers will not take a bid from someone who's not compliant already, because they put themselves at risk. That if they choose to award the bid to that person and they didn't become compliant, as you mentioned, now they're stuck. Now they have to go to another supplier, they have to do a new bid process, or maybe can't produce what they needed to produce if there's not someone else who can do it.
And I think that's a great point. And I think even back in the 800-171 days, there were certain bids where it was stamped on there that you must be 800-171 to bid on this, but others, they were just blank. They were just, here's an opportunity, do you want to bid on it? So I think those upstream prime contractors and upstream subcontractors really play an important part on how serious they're taking all of this.
For sure.
All right. So some of the things that have changed in the realm of procurement and getting certified, there's something that didn't exist before, as part of the compliance is, what is a POAM? And why is it important now when it didn't either exist or it wasn't important prior to this whole CMMC thing?
Yeah, the POAM. As you mentioned, in 800-171, you either were compliant or you weren't compliant, but nobody was checking.
Right.
Now that they're going to be checking, I think they anticipate people being a little more honest in their answers, if I'm being truthful.
Yeah.
And there's going to be some things that they're going to have check no on. And the POAM is the no but piece of this. So POAM is Plan of Actions and Mitigations. And it outlines for the controls that you are not compliant with today, this is your plan for becoming compliant. This is the thing you're going to do and the timeline within which you're going to do it. Now, not everything is POAM worthy. There are some controls that they would say, okay, we still won't award this to you because if you don't have multi-factor authentication, forget it, right? But there might be some controls in there that they'd say, okay, as long as you're in process of implementing that and you're rolling it out and it's going to be done in 3 months, that's okay. We'll accept that on a POAM, knowing that you're going to complete that and somebody's going to check on whether or not that gets completed and you have to submit.
You've committed to it.
You've committed to it.
Okay.
The downside is that you can't just check no to everything and say, well, I plan on doing it. That's not going to fly. Additionally, you can't say, I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it in 2 years. Generally, they want to see this stuff 3-6 months maximum for how you're going to fill those gaps.
I want to see you're serious about getting there.
Yeah, and that you've got a plan and that you're ready to invest the money. You know what it's going to take you to do it, and you're going to get it done. Because, again, we're back to protecting that CUI, and if you don't have that stuff protected, you're not doing the work.
Yep, completely agree. And I think this whole POAM idea came about when they went from, let's say, version 1 to version 2 of CMMC. They took a lot of heat and a lot of feedback at the Department of Defense and said, look, it's too strict. And that's one of the pieces that they've built into this to say, okay, we're going to be reasonable about this. But part of being reasonable is prudent as well. You're going to meet the really critical controls. Otherwise, you're dead in the water. You're not going to get any of the bids. But if you've got these others, we're going to, for the moment, 3 to 6 months, we're going to let them slide because we think you're being truthful, you're being honest, and you have a true plan. I think that's critical.
So the other document we talk about all the time, generally when we're doing an assessment for somebody, aside from the POAM, is the System Security Plan. Describe that.
So the System Security Plan is, this is not necessarily a push a button and it spits out a document that says, oh yeah, here's the magic of a system security plan. It is describing the systems that you have and not just how you're protecting them. That is at least half of it. But the other part is you need to spell out the criticality of those systems, those plans, and how they work together. If this system goes down, what's the impact? We had a discussion about this not too long ago, business impact assessment. If this system is the most critical thing in the world to me, it has to run. If it doesn't run, here's what happens. I can't ship product. I have no workaround. Well, it's like a manufacturing shop floor. If they don't have power, the machines aren't going to turn and they're not going to put out parts. What is their plan of attack? Well, I have a generator on backup that's ready to be delivered at a moment's notice. Okay, that is a plan to protect a particular type of system that you need and it's critical to your business. And it's basically going down the list of all of the systems that make your business run and explaining the protections that are in place and what criticality they have in order to run your business, produce whatever it is that you're making, and how you're going to get back up and running if they're offline. What does the recovery plan look like? Not with every little bullet point, but that there is a plan to getting it back up and running.
And does that generally come out of doing a gap assessment, A gap analysis project?
It is part of what we call an assessment. If we're doing a security assessment based on CMMC, we're providing a POAM, we're providing a system security plan, we're providing the gap analysis, we're providing a remediation plan that says, here are the gaps, here's the order of criticality of those gaps and how we would plug those gaps. We had a discussion with somebody the other day about, hey, you're using your Office 365 in the commercial world at Microsoft. You really need to be in GCC High because of the type of data you're working with on a daily basis, that you're interacting with. Okay, well, we're going to need to migrate data, migrate your email. We're going to have to set you up with a new tenant. All the pieces to that. That's all. That level of detail isn't in the system security plan. That's in the remediation plan. But the system itself and how it's being protected, how it's being backed up, are all components of that.
Great.
So now that we got through all the acronyms, how much does it cost to get compliant?
Great question. The answer to these questions generally starts with, it depends.
I've heard that.
But we like to break down the investment for becoming compliant into kind of 3 buckets. Your first bucket is going to be this assessment. Right? You need to figure out where your current state is and where you need to get to. That assessment project normally includes going through a gap analysis for all the controls, looking at remediation recommendations, looking at the pieces of the framework and figuring out how are we going to get from point A to point B. A gap assessment generally, I would say, takes in the neighborhood of 90 days, depending upon coordination between parties. And in general, I would say you should expect to spend between $15,000 to $20,000 to get an assessment done. I often get the question, is the assessment less if I have a simple environment? Maybe a little. If there's no infrastructure to deal with, if there's no pieces to look at for how are you securing this, how are you securing that, it might be simpler, but you still have to go through all 110 controls, and you have to know that it's taken care of.
So in that vein, a level 1 might be less than a level 2.
It's a good point, yes. A level 1, we've only got to look at 17 controls, then maybe you're looking at $7,000 to $10,000.
There you go.
Right, a level 2 would be that 15 to 20. If you have an extraordinarily complex, large environment, multi-site, etc., could be more than that. And that's your first piece of the investment. Figure out where you are and where you need to go.
Yeah.
Once you get that assessment complete, there's going to be remediation. Remediation could look like projects that need to get done. For example, you might need to migrate your Microsoft environment to GCC High. That's going to be a project. That's going to cost a one-time fee to be able to do that.
We've got a project for time and effort.
Yep, and then and the licensing actually goes into the third component for me, but there's going to be other kinds of projects that are those one-time investments that might be segmenting your network or implementing certain security controls that are kind of one-time projects. From what we've seen, again, all depends upon the environment and the state you start at, you're probably looking at somewhere from $20,000 to $100,000+ for those projects to get that done. There's I think very few we've ever seen that had so little to do it would fall under that. But certainly, again, large complex environment, if all the servers are running, server 2008 and have to be replaced, you're going to have a big ticket on your hands. So that's a second component, is doing the remediation one-time stuff. But then compliance is an ongoing thing. So you've got ongoing costs that happen. Some of that,
get there and stay there.
You got to get there, you got to stay there. Some of that is the licensing you mentioned, for example, right? The Microsoft 365 GCC High licensing is more than traditional licensing, sometimes up to double per user for that. There's going to be ongoing need for things like vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, employee awareness training, other types of security services that happen on a regular basis that need to be put into a program you're going to have to pay for monthly. And then you've got things like, security monitoring and
Log retention.
yeah, and even management of these tools like multi-factor authentication and the threat awareness tools and the endpoint protection.
They don't just work all the time.
It would be great if they did, but that's generally an ongoing investment that you're going to get into a program where you have to pay a monthly amount to be able to stay compliant in there. The range I like to use in there is somewhere between $250, could be up to $300 per computer user to stay compliant at that point. Again, those prices will vary based upon your environment's complexity, the things that need to be secured in there. But to give you a starting range for what that would be from an ongoing investment standpoint, you would look at that. And I would say that would include your, what I'll call traditional managed support provider costs. So it wouldn't be on top of that. That would include
This
that.
is an all-in type of thing.
Yeah, if one company's going to come in all in and do that for you, it would probably be about in that range.
Okay. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, we get that one a lot. That's the flip to the back of the proposal question.
Yeah,
We try to
certainly
answer
is.
as honestly as we can, knowing that there is no single answer to it. So now that we've told them how much it's going to be compliant, the next question I usually get is, how can I afford to do that? How can I afford to become compliant?
So the easy thing is, how can you afford not to? You love your business, you want it to succeed, but I think you really need to break this down. Use your 3-bucket analysis. How am I going to pay for that assessment? How am I going to get there? Well, one of the things that we've learned over time is that there are programs out there that states are running. The programs, the grants are all over the map. Maybe they're state run, that maybe there's some private funding behind them, but they will pay for assessments and even potentially projects or portions of projects moving forward, depending on the size of the grant, the size of your organization, how big the projects are. But I think that's a great resource to use to dive in and start understanding, exactly like you said, Mike, where am I? Where do I stand today? Because you can't do anything else until you figure that out.
Yeah,
And you'll never know where you
I think it's important on that grant stuff. Obviously, they're all different, but two common things that I've seen in there. Generally, there's a cap on it, 10
Yes.
grand, something
10
like
grand,
that.
20 grand, but it's not, they're just going to give you a pool of money regardless.
No, and the other factor that I've seen in some of those, it's a matching grant that says, okay, we'll pay 10,000 of that 20,000 project because they want to know you've got skin in the game. You're not just out there using up their money.
Yeah, so I think that's really important to understand. That resource is out there, but you're going to have to plan for what's my investment going to be. But I think you really have to understand, what do I have at risk? What portion of my business exists in this defense industrial base? Is this 5% of my business? Is it 55% of my business? Is it 95% of my business, where if I don't do this, I don't have a business? To determine how critical is it for you to go down this path. And we've talked to people that have said, this is only 10% of my business. Well, it may not be worth going through the compliance effort if 10% of your business could go away tomorrow and it doesn't have a life and death determining factor associated with it. If your business is going to move along and you're willing to let that go, maybe that's a business decision you have to make.
Well, and percentage obviously is of the whole. And if you talk to let's say a $1 million manufacturer, 10%, $100,000, this is likely going to cost you more than that by the time you're done.
And 100,000 is top line sales. That's not what your
That's not
margin
your
is
margin,
making on
right?
it. So you got to
10% of a $1 billion company.
Hey now.
Right. So it's you really have to look at the individual needs of the
Yeah.
organization, and does the math make sense?
Hey, we talked to a $1 billion company that it's probably 5% of their business, but it's a $1 billion company that has 5% of their business wrapped up in this. And they've got thousands of employees and a little pocket, but this business is important to them.
Right.
And it's something they're trying to grow.
That's
I
the
think
key, right? It's something there where it's a business they want to be in.
Yeah.
Something they like
They
hanging
made
their
a
hat on.
conscious decision about
Correct.
it. Yeah.
Yep.
So I think that's really critical. So Mike, we were just talking about, how do I afford to do this and methods to defray some of the cost and be able to get contributions from state funding and those sorts of things. Now, if I decide to do this, what are my top challenges? What are the hurdles in getting to compliancy?
Yeah, I think there's a handful that we're seeing people struggle with. First is timeline and timeline management, because this process, can take a while. It's likely not going to happen overnight. We talked about the assessment being, 90 days by itself. So, not putting it off. And a lot of people, kind of burying their head in the sand, like I'll deal with it as soon as it's final, as soon as it comes out, are going to put themselves at a disadvantage because they're going to find out, the process to make this happen is going to take a while, and we can dive into that as well. But I think that's kind of step one. Step two, we hit on a little bit with the investment, with the cost. There is an investment to do this. There is significant investment in some cases to do this. And figuring out for your organization whether or not it's a good match for what your business goals are is important. And even if it is, you still have to come up with the money. And so looking at how you're going to rearrange your P&L or how you're going to generate the additional revenue by doing this that's going to help justify it is going to be an effort that's got to be taken on by by the leadership of the organization and determine, all right, this is how we need to get there, and it's not insignificant. So I think that's one of those challenges. From a technical standpoint, a lot of the controls and things can be implemented fairly easily. The things like the multi-factor authentication and the DNS filtering and those kinds of things, but there are technical challenges which could be bigger. I think the migration to Microsoft GCC High is one of those. It's not a push-a-button migration that just gets done overnight, as if you were moving from one tenant to another tenant in Microsoft's commercial environment. So I think that's one that plays a part in thinking about the planning, the investment, and disruption to the business a little bit, because there's going to be some business disruption as part of that, unlike some of the other technical controls that I managed.
That whole GCC High migration, I can't even tell you how many times we went back and forth with a client just to find out, hey, have you been approved by Microsoft to become a tenant inside that government data center? It's not, I'll just log in and I'll create new tenant. What's the domain I'm using? And off to the races. You can't even get to step one until you get to step point one. And
they have to say it's okay, and they're going to do it in their sweet time.
And this client that I'm speaking of, how many submissions? 4, 5, 6 times they were submitting once a week to see if that would move the needle. And of course, as you just said, that's not going to move the needle with Microsoft. You could submit it 100 times that application, but it's not going to happen until they're ready for it to happen. So you need to factor in time for these things.
Yeah. Another challenge I think that organizations are going to face is that if they've never done cybersecurity controls in their organization before, things are going to look and feel different to their employees. They're going to have employees who never used multi-factor authentication are going to have to do that. They're going to get
employees that have never been trained before.
Employees that have never been trained before are going to have to go through that. One of the controls was about limiting access to data, and it used to be that everybody could get access to everything, but now that's all going to be split down. There's going to be some operational transition that comes along, and that's true whether or not you're going through CMMC compliance or even just implementing a good security program. But it is going to be real for people going through this. There is going to be a little disruption through all of that.
It'll be a little pain.
And I think the last piece, and this is still a little bit of an unknown, is the audit process. The audit process is, they're building that boat as they're going down the river a little bit. Still training and certifying auditors, to be able to be ready to do all of this work that they need to do. And it's a little unclear what that process is going to look and feel like. So I think if you go through a good assessment process and a good remediation process and can really get your ducks in a row from a evidence standpoint,
Yeah,
like the documentation,
yeah.
the policies, all the things that you know the auditor is going to be looking for when it comes time for that, you can smooth that out a little bit.
Yeah.
And
Limit the scrambling.
limit the scrambling and frankly probably make the auditor's life a lot easier, which is probably going to make your life a lot easier and have that audit cost less money.
Yeah, that's a good point, because that amount of time that the auditor spends there is going to translate to real dollars spent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
So I talked a little bit about timeline as a challenge. Tell me about timeline. How long is it going to take to become compliant?
Yeah. Did you say it depends? Is that
You can't use my answer.
Is that a theme throughout this? Look, it does depend a little bit on how far down the road you've gotten with your cybersecurity plan, how good of a program, how many controls you've already implemented. But I think to start with Mike's 90-day, from the time you sign the contract until the time you have documents in your hand that say, this is where I stand, I don't think you should expect them to happen any quicker than 3 months. Okay, so you have that. Now, what's next? Well, we have the projects. You have a project list, and we provide one of these to every one of our clients that we do an assessment for. And I'm not so sure I've seen one that's less than 2 pages. Some I've seen that are 3 or 4 pages. And you try to determine how critical they are and how quickly you can implement them. But I don't think you can expect that implementation is going to happen any faster than a year. There's just things that you can't do concurrently. And if you need a GCC high migration, I don't think you should expect that one item to take less than 90 days. And there's people out there that will tell you it will take a year. Now, I think that's overstating things, but depending on the size of your organization, the complexity, let's go to multiple sites coming in from different email platforms, it could take 6 months. That's not crazy. And of course, let's go to disruption. How disruptive is it going to be? Oh, we're on Microsoft Office 2013. Okay, throw that in the garbage. That's no longer supported. You've got to get on current technology. And now you start looking at everything. You've got Windows 7 machines. What are you doing with Windows 7 machines? Well, we've got the system. It's only supported on Windows 7. Okay, now we've got to implement new switches to be able to segment the network and carve that off into a separate area. It takes equipment. Oh, you've got Windows 2012 servers? Well, those just went end of life back last October. Those have got to get replaced. Those are a security hole. Okay, well, we don't have hardware to run that on. Okay, well, we need to buy new hardware. That year,
Projects can pile up.
the year can vanish easily. Now, you got to determine where you are after that year. Have I, remediated everything? I hate to say the probable answer is maybe not. Maybe I've gotten 80%, 90% of the way there. You're into the whole POAM thing. Now I've promised this stuff will be done by such and such a date. Now you've got to schedule your audit. Okay, when's the audit going to take place? Well, I can tell you it's not going to take place the moment you go to schedule it. Go back to your comment, Mike, about how many auditors. Not enough is the answer right now. I don't even know when there will be enough of them. They are really pushing very hard to get them certified. At last check, there were 67 of them. They need 670 of them.
Minimum.
Yeah, just to start the real ball rolling. Because think about it, it's got to happen every 3 years to the masses. So 3 to 6 months scheduling just to get the audit done, that's not unrealistic. Yeah. And so all of this is, kind of piles on top of each other. I think 2 years is a reasonable number if you're starting with knowing, I hate to say this, but knowing nothing. You don't know really where you are, no stamp of approval. I think that's what the expectation should be. 18 months to 2 years is a pretty common number that we talk about.
Well, and one of those things about the audit is that they don't want to just know that you did it, they want to know that you do it. So you got to
operationalize. Yes,
got to
yes.
operationalize those controls, right? If you're doing vulnerability scanning, they don't want to know you did one.
Ah,
They
you
wanna-
did one last week?
Yeah, great.
When
did
was
you
the
do-
last one?
Right. When was the one before that? What have you done about the stuff you saw? They want to see progress.
Yeah.
That's going to be part of the audit. So including all that in there, it's just going to
good
take
point.
more time.
Yeah, that's a really good
Couple of
point.
years,
And
yeah.
that's that point, but you're absolutely right that, you know, that they are going to look at a point in time, but they want to see that you've been doing things over time.
So they want to see the history.
Yeah, they really do. So, what does an assessment process really look like? Are you coming on site? Are you doing it remotely? How much of my time as the client is it going to take? What's involved?
Yeah. So yes to all of that.
Ooh.
The process
yes.
generally starts with a review of the 110 controls, questionnaire style, but it's not just ask the question, the answer is yes or no, right? It's ask the question, understand how that question applies to your organization, determine where the control remediation has taken place. Is it really complete for what the control is asking for? And
How have you been implemented it?
how have you implemented it, and does that meet the control standards?
Yep.
So that generally takes somewhere in the neighborhood, I'm going to say, of 4 to 6 hours of time. It is generally done remotely over a like Teams meeting, something like that. Broken into 1 hour sections because most people can't take more than an hour of that.
It's the truth.
And really stay focused on making sure we're doing it right. Because again, this is going to be audited at some point. So we want to make sure we didn't just check the box and said, do you use multi-factor? Yes. Oh, but you're not using it for everyone. You're not using it login. You're not using it here. You're not right. We got to ask enough questions to know we're actually meeting the control, because the auditor is going to look this time. And so that's important. So that takes some time. That takes time from business resources as well as technical resources in the client organization, because there are some controls that are technical and some that are more process driven. Subsequent to the verbal evaluation, we would then go on site and do a visual verification of all the answers. So collect some evidence about the things we were told. All right, you said that you require complex passwords with a regular change frequency, etc. Show me that policy, pull up that group policy, prove it, screenshot it, save it out, and we attach it into the control in the assessment, so that we've got some of that evidence you're going to need at some point in the future, and we're collecting it as we go. We've also verified that it wasn't just lip service. You actually are doing it, right? You're talking about multi-factor everywhere. We're going to want to see you get to a couple of machines and have to multi-factor in different places, not just one multi-factor in one place, right?
Show me on VPN that it's actually enforced.
Yeah, so depending upon the size and complexity of the environment, that might be a half day to a day on site, probably for a CISO level resource and a network engineer, security engineer to be there going through that type of stuff. Once that visual verification's done, all that information comes back together, churns up in the machine that is our CISO services, so that they can figure out, okay, what's actually met, what's partially met, what's not met, what's that gap analysis look like. From the gaps, then, okay, based upon what we know about this organization and their needs, what would remediation look like? Put together remediation recommendations, put it together in a remediation plan, and be able to give something back to the client that is actionable as soon as they have that. Generation of the POAM and the SSP are all part of that, but the focus really is that remediation plan, so that we can figure out, okay, how do we get you now to point B? How do we get you to compliance?
You got to move forward, and you got to figure out where to start.
Yeah, and that's usually a couple hour meeting by the time we're done, and that's usually done face to face as well, so we can talk through the things that are there and figure out how can we help.
Got it. Very good, Mike. Love it.
So those are the basic questions. We get a lot about the CMMC process. We hope that this was valuable information in your CMMC journey. We'd love to be there to guide you along the way, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon.